My guest is Steve Auth. By day, Steve is an investor on Wall Street, but when he's off work, you just might find him at the Met in New York City. Steve serves as Executive Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of Federated Global Equities. He is a frequent guest on Fox Business News, CNBC, and Bloomberg TV. And now he's a guest on the Regular Catholic Guy Show. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Great to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
We're going to be discussing Steve's new book, Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. Hey, Steve, I saw that on Amazon, the book is #1 bestseller in museum studies and museology. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's terrific. You know, Amazon's had troubles keeping the book stocked, honestly. It's very interesting. But
that's really great.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I'd rather they kept it stocked, but hopefully your viewers can get it. Although you can also get it on Sophia Institute Press.
Right. And we'll put the links to both of those in the show notes, so you have the opportunity to be able to purchase the book.
Yeah.
I'm going to take you back in time a little bit, Steve. What got you interested in art in the first place?
Yeah, that goes all the way back to my years at college at Princeton. You know, I was a history, economics major, but every chance I took, I slip in an extra course in art history. I just was something fascinated about it. I think it's what fascinates everybody. Like, we're attracted to beauty. God is beauty. And I guess even then, it was that kind of lure of beauty and the search for God somehow going on in my somewhat mixed up brain at that time that attracted me. And it created a lifelong journey where, Evelyn and I, Evelyn, my wife, is also very interested in art. And the two of us were giving tours of the Met to all our visitors that would come that wanted to see the museum. And it helps to have someone who knows the way around. And we got to really know the thing. But, the Lord has ways of working with us. And I still think, even then, he was trying to call to me through the art. And I think of certain paintings we could talk about later that at the time I didn't understand but was attracted to, that I now really get. But at some point, it's actually how the Pilgrimage Museum starts. Is me in front of a Rembrandt painting called The Toilet of Bathsheba with a Met docent. And she's doing the very standard kind of archaeological, clinical, called scientific description of the art, which was frankly how I was taught to understand art and talk about it in a kind of very scholarly way, if you will, which, by the way, is what puts most people to sleep. But I've got that kind of head, I guess. So, but I'm standing there, and having grown much deeper in my own faith at this point, through a kind of series of conversion experiences. It took more than one for me, by the way. But being more attuned, I'm standing there, and while I can't disagree with anything she's saying, it finally dawns on me, this painting is not about, Rembrandt's Oriental period, or his only nude that he painted, or not only, but one of few, or, brush strokes. These are, it was about all those things in some ways, but the painting is about, it's not even about Bathsheba. It's about David. And in some ways, it's about Rembrandt. And at a deeper level, it's about me or you, and what I'm really looking at here in this beautiful image isn't Bathsheba at all, but it's the image of Bathsheba in David's head as he stares out from her from the shadows of his castle in the upper left corner of this painting. And Rembrandt was really into trying to paint the soul of man, and here he is actually painting what Rembrandt, what David is seeing in his own head, And of course, the Dutch Reformed viewer of the 1600s in Amsterdam that Rembrandt's painting for would also understand instantly that this is all about the slippery slope of sin, because they know the whole story of David's fall that happens from this one instance of being in the wrong place at the wrong time on the top of that castle. But of course, the modern day viewer at the Met goes by it and sees an interesting painting of a kind of mysterious painting of a nude woman, but they don't know about this fall about she, they don't know the whole story. And that led to when I came back from the museum that night, I said to Ev, sweetie, we've been doing this tour the wrong way. I mean, this is all about man's search for God, really. If we take the assumption that God has planted in our souls the image of himself and the desire to seek him, and he's planted particularly in the talent of these artists, particular talent in describing beauty, right? That is their talent that they receive. They're all seeking God in some ways, even the ones that don't realize they're seeking God. They're seeking beauty, but through that, they're seeking him. And we started to redo the whole tour. And, once we did that, it opened a floodgate of rethinking everything. And the more we did, the more we saw it. This goes back, you could go back to the very beginning of Western art and see this. And we start out in ancient Egypt in 2300 BC. That's where the pilgrimage really begins after this initial scene before the Rembrandt. And, it's a 5,000-year journey through time and art and culturally, times of different spiritualities, paganism and atheism, but deep Catholicism, mysticism. But through it all, you see the artists struggling to find God in some ways. And what's really interesting is that the themes and motifs that happen in one century, you'll see them recur again 5 centuries later. And you're like, where's all this stuff coming from? Of course, it's coming from God.
Right.
And it just became a kind of gripping narrative. And these tours started, as a result, by the way, became longer and more popular. Whereas the average tour, most people can handle about 30 minutes before their eyes start to glaze over. No one ever leaves at that point because they don't want to be a bore. So they hang in there another 30 minutes. But most people walk away from museum visits a little bit dissatisfied because God has been sanitized out of the discussion. But once you bring him back in and you start looking at it that way, the thing becomes gripping. And these tours grew to 3.5 hours. We initially tried to make them 2 hours, and it went to 3.5 hours. And you'd think by then people are completely wrecked. But our little groups would be on my heels to the very last painting and kind of almost in tears at the end of the tour. And then we'd go off to dinner for 2 or 3 hours, and it just goes on. And almost everyone that's taken this tour, and there's a long list of people that are still trying to take it, and we can only physically do so many of these things.
Right.
I have a day job, but they all have been encouraging me over the years to put this in the form of a book, to share it with more people, which, as usual with these kinds of calls to do things, I resist, because I don't know, just the way I am, But COVID came along, and there I had some free time. My social calendar had just been incinerated. And I used that time that the Lord gave me to really sit down and put this down in writing and share this story with more people. And I'm hopeful it gets in a lot of folks' hands, because it really does. Everyone that takes this tour, and I think that reads the Pilgrimage, it is a pilgrimage. In the end of the day, it's about our own souls, and we see in the art our own struggles to find God. And we see the moments of triumph and also the moments of defeat, temporary defeat, I think, usually, but, and how to take wrong turns and right turns. And it just, I know it's a great journey. It's been a great journey so far with this.
What got you started doing the tours, Steve?
Well, I mean, that was just trying to be hospitable. I know something about art, and folks come to New York. That's always something everyone wants to do is go to the museum, but it's a daunting idea to go there. It's the Metropolitan Museum in particular is just an encyclopedic collection. Probably, I think, the broadest and deepest in the world, really. Other museums are particularly good at certain periods, but the Met really, given the wealth in New York, from the late 1900s, was able to assemble this collection. But yeah, so it was really just trying to be hospitable and my own interest in it, as I said earlier. But once we realized that this was actually a form of evangelization, that really motivated us, because I think, you probably know from having perhaps read my first book, The Missionary of Wall Street, that is my calling in my mind. I mean, I think that is, my secular job is as the chief investment officer and all that, but my real calling, I think, is to be an evangelist for the Lord. I think that's many of our callings, right? But we're talking about in the break, I just happened to pick up the phone, maybe at the wrong time. In any case, so that's where a lot of our energy is in New York, even to this day. We're doing a great mission. We've actually expanded the mission now to St. Patrick's Cathedral as well as Old St. Pat's down in Soho. So we're doing one on September 23rd for the Feast of Padre Pio, one of the great confessors. And if anyone's in New York and wants to join us, we'll be at the cathedral from 2 to 9 on that Friday night. And it's overwhelming when we do the mission at St. Patrick's. I got to tell you, our hit rate is so high there relative to, I mean, I'll say 10 to 1, which your viewers may think sounds horrible. Believe me, on the streets of Soho, it's some nights 60 to 1. But I always tell the missionaries, 1 is all it takes. I mean, 1 soul for eternity is eternity. In any case, that's our real passion. And then when we realized that this tour is a form of evangelization, because you can reach out to all sorts of people. You can use it with very faithful and devout Catholics. There you can really dial it up, and it can be a very moving experience for folks. But you can also dial it down to folks that are struggling to find their way back to the faith, or that maybe have even lost it. And it just forces being confronted with all this beauty and these sort of eternal messages. We can talk about some of them if you like, but it just forces an introspection. I've had priests tell me after the tour and sitting through the dinner afterwards where we unpack it all, they've said to me, Steve, I've been working with that couple for 3 years. In one night, somehow or other, you and Evelyn got them to spill their spiritual guts out on the table in front of perfect strangers. I go, we didn't do it, the art did it, the Lord did it,
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going to happen when you read the Pilgrimage to the Museum. I'm hoping that Catholic groups around the country will use it as a book, like a book club kind of thing. It's very digestible. It's written in short little pieces, and it would make an ideal. I mean, and the art is so moving. Everyone's going to have their own view of it, but it certainly will inspire a lot of healthy introspection.
Yeah, when I was going through the book, I felt like I was actually going on the tour with you.
Yeah, we wanted to create that feel. I mean, not in a literal sense, right, Jeff? I mean, it's not painful, like every painting, now turn left, now turn right. The painting, we didn't do that. It's snippets like that creates the atmosphere of I'm on the tour. And the voices, when we do the tour, it's usually Evelyn and I, and then often a priest. And often the priest is Father Sean Aaron, who's listed as a co-author. So their voices are in the pilgrimage also, and again, not in an overbearing way where, okay, Father, your turn, okay, Evelyn, your turn, but you'll see their voices come in and out of the narrative in a way that evokes the atmosphere of being on this tour in an atmospheric kind of way that I must say, in addition to the way it was written, Sophia helped a lot with this, with the way I've had people in the book business look at this book and say, my goodness, this was a love note from your publisher. There's a lot less expensive ways to, and the book's not ridiculous. It's $20, I think, or $19.99, but they really went out of their way to try to evoke the experience of this. So, most art books, if there are color plates at all, they're all collected together at the center. That's the inexpensive way to do it. It's more economical. Because you have to have different kind of paper to do full color. Sophia chose to do the whole book with that kind of paper. So as a result, the paintings are incorporated where they're discussed in the text. And so it really kind of just flows like you're there, It's really beautifully done, I must say. I'm not taking credit for it. I didn't lay it out or make those decisions, but I thought they did a great job.
Well, it is awesome to be able to have the paintings in the book as you're going through the book as well.
Yeah.
So who's better on the tour, you or Evelyn?
Well, I always feel like I'm better, but the vote at the end of the night, somehow she always wins. It makes me crazy, Jeff. Just between you and me, let's keep that off the air.
Okay.
You can say that. But she has just such a way with her, and she's sort of like a mystic, And I always tell people it's a little bit, I don't know, this is kind of long-winded, maybe I'll make it short, but if you know Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where the choir is there and people aren't used to having a choir there, they're like, what is the choir doing here? And the first movement comes and goes, they don't sing, the second, the third, halfway through the fourth, what's going on here, And then suddenly the singer, stands up and starts singly taking on the whole choir, in this beautiful voice, singing the Ode to Joy. And that's kind of how the tour goes. Like, we start off and I'm talking about the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks and the early Christian communities, et cetera. And then we get to this, and people are going like, what is she doing here with that docent tag on? Because we have, we're temporary docents whenever we give the tour at the Met, so we're kind of registered. So, and then suddenly there she is, She does this painting that's in the book called Mary, Jesus and Mary with the intercession of Jesus and Mary for the sinners. And the way it got into the tour was many years ago when I was showing her triumphantly my new work of art here, she says, and we're going through the museum, she goes, Steve, what about this painting? I go, sweetie, really? Like, that's Lorenzo Monaco. He's kind of a lesser artist. It's not that important. Oh, but Steve, I really do think it's important. I think you should consider that. I go, sweetie, it's really not that important. So, I go back a week later and I'm thinking, what is she seeing in this painting? And, well, Jesus and Mary interceding for the sinners has become the focal point of the entire journey, if you will. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can get to the nut of it quickly. So you have this image painted, and it's kind of the juxtaposition of classical art history study and spirituality. You're here in the late medieval period. It's called the International Gothic style. So the medieval painters were always thinking about painting images in heaven, right? That's why their images are mostly two-dimensional, right, or somewhat abstract. They're not trying to show you people on earth. We're kind of lifting you up to heaven. And Jesus and Mary appear bigger than life. I mean, this is an 8-foot high painting, and they absorbed 6 feet of it, kneeling before God the Father. And they're abstract, they're idealized figures, they're in heaven. Mary is pointing to her breast to Jesus and saying, like any Jewish mother, I nursed you, I brought you, for this purpose, to save these sinners. The sinners are at her feet, kneeling down. And Jesus, in turn, is pointing to his wounds to his Father and saying, Father, this is why I suffered for these people. And then the Lord responds, God responds by sending the love of the Holy Spirit down. And you can see the unity of the Trinity. They all have a special halo with a little cross on it. So, they're the Trinity. And by the way, this is a good painting we use with folks that are of the Protestant persuasion, because a lot of them misunderstand our relationship with Mary, as Catholics. So Mary is clearly painted here as not a God. She has a different halo, like the rest of us, but she's interceding for us with God, right? But the thing that I love about the painting, Jeff, is that there at the feet of Mary are these little tiny figures, and they're painted in the Renaissance style. Monaco was painting at a transition time, so he was aware of both styles, capable of both. It wasn't that he was a primitive that only could paint in 2 dimensions. And he's painting portraits. These are real life people with dimples and little warts on their noses, and one is a nun and one is a brother. So it's a family, right? And here's the punchline. This is a very expensive painting. It's mostly blue, which is lapis, which tells you this is a precious stone. It's been ground down. This thing cost a fortune to produce. It is the patron of the painting that has had himself painted into the picture as the sinner, kneeling at the feet of Jesus as Mary gently pushes him forward. You are God, I am not. This is a theme that comes up and down through the history of art. Right in the very beginning, in the tomb of Perneb, you get the opposite effect where, Perneb is trying to make himself a god, like, and everyone laughs at that. And then I remind everyone, isn't that what we all do, right? I mean, at the end of the day, he's got himself painted as God, the big guy, and everything else is a little guy. But here, in this wonderful little, not little, big, but perhaps less well-known image of Mary and Jesus interceding for the sinners, you see someone who actually gets it right, kneeling humbly at the feet of Jesus. And I must say that, to answer your question, everyone says sometimes I'm too long-winded, but yeah, that painting often gets voted number 1 of the night. Very disappointing.
And from what I recall, that particular painting is not like one that stands out. It's like off away in a corridor or something.
Yeah, it's on a back wall. It's you can walk right past it and never even see it.
Steve, you talked about in college that you were agnostic. Is that right?
Well, I was raised as a Catholic. I was an altar boy. But 4 years of very secular education, and I really shouldn't blame that. Maybe blame myself, but I certainly faded away. And I describe myself as an indifferent agnostic, probably worse than being a faithful atheist, actually.
How did art lead you back to the church?
Well, I think actually the Lord led me back through some pretty dramatic, smacks over the head with a very large baseball bat, including, a near-death experience and then going blind on a mission in Mexico. And I recovered from that, by the way, or he recovered me from that. But so that was the big piece of it. But I think art in some ways did lead me back. And I'm thinking about, Jeff, about a painting in the tour. and in the Pilgrimage that even when I was at Princeton, Princeton had a version of this painting, Princeton's own art library. The artist is Watteau. And late in his life, Watteau, and Pilgrimage has a number of paintings I call last words, which are very interesting. These are like last paintings of an artist. So the kind of the culmination and maybe kind of the head, where their head is at as they move towards the eternal, right? So this is one of Watteau's last paintings. It's called the Mezzotint. It's at the Met. And it's a painting in the Rococo style. So in the 1700s, kind of lighthearted period of time for painting. Mostly interior decorating projects were being done by the wealthy nobles. And the artists were being asked to participate in this almost prostitution of their own talents, if you will, to something very secular, right? And Watteau is painting one of these paintings. It's called the Mezzotint. It's a painting of a musician. And the one at the Met is called the Clown. I mean, at the Princeton University Museum, but a very similar concept. You have this musician who's presumably very talented and whose job is to entertain, sitting in a garden alone at the end of the day. He's been entertaining in one of these, French Victorian type gardens, not Victorian, but, Ancien Regime kind of things, Versailles setting type thing. And he's looking up at the heavens, strumming on his guitar, but instead of a look of happiness and joy, which you'd expect someone might have after spending the day outdoors doing what he likes to do, there's this look of deep sadness and regret. And as I've contemplated on this painting, and maybe, did this draw me back? I don't know, but I've kind of figured out, I'm a little dense at times. So it took a while to figure this out. But in a way, what Watteau is painting here is how we end up feeling after we've turned away from God and used our talents that he's given us for ill purpose. And in some ways, I think back to my first confession during this near-death experience of mine. My first confession in 30 years, it seemed like a good idea at that moment. And, the priest said to me afterwards, Steve, there's some issues here, but the really biggest one is that the Lord has given you a boatload of talents, and you've been using them for your own purposes, not for his. That's the best way to summarize what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And I resolved I was going to use my talents for his purposes, not mine, going forward. And I've been trying to stick to that. I fall away at times, but that's sort of the game plan. And Watteau, I think, was feeling, that's an image for me, what happens when we take that wrong turn. I like to meditate on that painting to remind myself that's how you feel when you take the wrong turn, when you cut yourself off.
Mm-hmm. God leads us all in different ways.
Yeah.
And as Bishop Barron has said, that beauty will lead us to the church.
Yeah, Bishop Barron's onto this. Or he might say the opposite. I mean, I'm not in his league, obviously, but in terms of shining his shoes, I would at least try to do that. And that ultimately is what Pilgrimage to the Museum is about. It's this search for God through beauty, who is the source of all beauty. And, sometimes the artists find it and sometimes they don't. I mean, there are moments in the pilgrimage, we should warn your listeners, that can be quite dark. I struggled with some of those chapters. There's one chapter called The the end of the soul and the death of God. And it was a dark time writing them almost, and Evelyn would buck me up at the end of every day and have something positive to say usually, but yeah, I mean, isn't that life though? It's not always comes up roses, and we take wrong turns and we lose our way. But what I marveled about, even in those periods where we lose God, if you will, historically or perhaps personally, he always finds a way to get us back, the hound of heaven. And he's actually always there. There's a painting by Monet in the Pilgrimage Museum called Rouen Cathedral. And some of your viewers may have seen a version. He painted 34 versions of Rouen Cathedral. He lived in the apartment across the street. And at that time, Nietzsche had already declared God dead, and Monet himself was an atheist. And he was painting the cathedral simply because it was an interesting surface to display his dexterity in painting different times a day where light is shining on a stone or maybe even moonlight, and they're all marvelous and beautiful. But he has painted them as a tomb. I mean, we've been earlier in the pilgrimage inside a church with the beautiful stained glass windows in the Middle Ages, and heaven on earth is happening in the Eucharist, and you can feel the presence of God. But in Monet's version, the church is cold. We're seeing it from the outside. The windows are gray from the outside. He's removed all the statues. The Rouen Cathedral has, I think, 36 statues of saints of all ages, on the facade. They've all been removed by the artist here. They're kind of blurred out. The doors are closed. There's nobody there. It's in Monet's mind, God is dead, really, and there's this tomb. And Evelyn always likes to pipe in, that he may be dead in Monet's mind, but in some ways God has found him, right? He has the last laugh. I mean, this painting is absolutely beautiful, and you can see the sunlight and the sky and who created all these things, And so even in death, he's there, right? That's Christ risen. So there's great beauty in it, and even in suffering, there's great beauty.
Take us back to where we started with Rembrandt's painting, The Toilet of Bathsheba. Tell us about the dangerous second look, Steve.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's my priest friend says to me, that first look is not really your fault, but the second look is. So the dangerous second look is, when we're constantly being tempted by sin. I mean, whether it's the sin of lust or the sin of greed or whatever it is, that's our particular weakness, right? And in the spiritual life, as fallen human beings, we can't help but, and of course, Satan's out there. This chapter called The Battle of Light and Darkness, where we kind of really get into this, but the Toilet of Bathsheba is from that chapter. And he's out there constantly throwing these looks, if you will, in our path. And sometimes we get down on ourselves for having even seen something or thought about doing something. But it's really all about advancement in the spiritual life is all about not so much the first look or the first thought, but at the second. So that, to advance in the spiritual life, what we have to work on is controlling the second look, the second thought, and dwelling on it and thinking, let me play with this idea for a while, and then I'll back off. Well, that often leads to the third look. And then you're on the slippery slope. And before you know it, you've not only had an affair with Bathsheba, you've made her pregnant, you've murdered her husband, and you've completely unwound your entire relationship with God, who you're now hiding from. So best not to take the second look.
What else would you like to share with regular Catholic guys out there, Steve?
Well, there's another motif in the book. I call it the faces I wear, and there's this image. It's actually one of the only surviving full 8-foot bronze sculptures from the Roman era. It's the Emperor Trebonius Gallus. And the Romans are in this period where basically it's a godless society. They have some superstitious versions of gods and things, but the Romans basically believe there is no eternity. It's here or never, and so be it. And it was a kind of dog eat dog kind of culture. And Trebonius Gallus in the middle, around 250 AD, becomes emperor by murdering his boss, the emperor, in the field of battle. And only lasts, by the way, 3 or 4 years before the similar thing happens to him. So, but in the meantime, he has this beautiful statue of himself made as a triumphant emperor. But you see the face of Trebonius Gallus, and we have a close-up of that face in the Pilgrimage. And it's a godless man, and as a result, that face has those creased brows and the look of worried, like, of course that's the case, right? I've got the whole world on my shoulders, look at me. And next to Trebonius Gallus, and I always wonder whether the Met did this on purpose. I don't think so. I think it's just a function of the fact that it made sense. They had another emperor from Rome, bust there. They put him, it's Constantine. And Constantine, of course, is the first emperor to bring Christianity to the empire. And, if you were a historian, you'd say to yourself, well, Constantine had a little more to worry about than Trebonius Gallus. I mean, by the time of Constantine, the barbarians were literally at the gates, practically. And yet, there's Constantine, a man of God. His face has got this wonderful serenity and hopefulness into it as he looks up to heaven. And I always say to myself, and I would challenge to the guys out there, since you asked, when I leave the house in the morning, it's a conscious decision. I say to myself, am I going to have that Trebonius Gallus face on? Or am I going to have the face of Constantine on? The faces I wear. And the faces I wear sometimes be the person inside and vice versa. They're kind of interrelated. So it's a good way to leave. It's a good image, I think. And as you walk out the door, and by the way, as you walk back in the door, when you come home, and you might have had that Trebonius Gallus face on, but there's still time to rescue yourself. Take a deep breath, say a Hail Mary and an Our Father, and greet your wife with the look of Constantine. The Trebonius Gallus face recurs throughout the pilgrimage. I mean, you see it in the face of Peter, for instance, at the moment of his betrayal of Christ, in a great painting by Caravaggio. By the way, another last work, which you could think about for a while, if you like. What I like about the Caravaggio is that even as Peter has this Trebonius Gallus face on, as he realizes in horror what he's done, Caravaggio gently references his ultimate conversion back to God through the reconciliation, in John 21. And you can see in the armor of the guard that's, accusing Peter, a reflection of light coming from Christ, who's in the background being, tried by Pontius Pilate. And that reflection bounces off the armor to light up the face of Peter. So I think it's Caravaggio's hopeful way, because himself, Caravaggio, as most people know, because it's pretty well documented these days, about all his struggles,
Mm-hmm.
Here's Caravaggio near the end of his life, who's, dies mysteriously running from the Knights of Malta after another run-in down there. And anyway, here he is, and he's choosing to kind of allude to this potential for reconciliation that we all have, to get that pace of Constantine back on. There's another one that is a great image. It's an image of a woman, by the way, but it's a great one for us guys. And it's a very unusual image. It's in the Pilgrimage. I call it the Catholic Mona Lisa. And the name of the painting is The Virgin Annunciata by Antonello de Messina. It's in a little museum in Palermo. It has only been out of that museum twice in its history, 500 years. Once for a few weeks at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was where I saw it. And what's amazing about this Virgin Annunciata painting of this simple Jewish girl as she's taking on this job, if you will, it's the only Annunciation painting ever done, at least at this period, where the angel is not there. And what I love about that is it brings to us regular folks the reality of Mary's situation, right? The ambiguity. Like, can you imagine if an angel appeared to you at night?
No.
You know, the next day, like, was that an angel? What, am I crazy? What happened there? And by the way, angels appear to us at night. We get calls. I answer the call. I wonder in my own life how many calls I thought were a wrong number or just a bad dream. So here we have this ambiguity, right? Mary, alone in her room, it's dark. But we know an angel's there for two reasons. One, the prayer book, probably this book of Psalms that she's been reading, preparing her heart, which, by the way, is another good thing if you're going to answer a phone call. Be prepared. So, but the pages are fluttering in the breeze as the angel has arrived. And her first instinct, and this would have been mine, I think, is to clasp her blouse closed to protect her modesty. And also just to kind of indicate what the heck is going on. And then her right hand, and this is where I'm sure my right hand would have done this, it kind of thrusts out saying, slow down a minute here. But what's different about what I think I would have done and what Mary does is the hand actually, and somehow Messina paints the hand in motion. It starts out saying stop, but it starts to curl. And you can actually see it curling as she's considering carefully this message from God. She's trying to, to bring her will and her expectations of her plans to get married to Joseph and lead an idyllic life in Nazareth, how they're now just been completely disrupted. And she's trying to get this sorted out in her head. And imagine, he's asked her, and this is what I love about this scene, because the danger of it's there. Usually the Annunciation scenes are almost idyllic, it's a kind of very formal, and Mary's like the superhuman. But the actual situation is she's being asked to take on a job that probably is going to lead to her stoning the next morning. As soon as Joseph hears about this, the likelihood, the average, male at the time would say, okay, well, that's the end of that. She gets stoned, story over. And by the way, if she doesn't get stoned, and this guy really is going to be the king of the Jews, that means Herod's going to be after him. And if we escape Herod, we got to deal with the Romans. And the only escape route is a 500-mile trek across a dangerous, robber-filled desert to a foreign land. So this is not exactly an easy ask. Let's put it that way. And yet, and this is, I think, the inspiration for the average guy is you get through all that and you look at Mary's eyes and her lips, because isn't it the case with many of us? I don't know, I don't want to accuse the rest of your viewers, but let me just say in my case, I'll finally bring myself to say yes, maybe somewhat reluctantly. But then somehow or other, I'll get distracted and I don't implement the ask, right? And here in this case, you're looking at this image of this young Jewish girl alone, and these eyes of determination and these lips that are pursed. And you say to yourself, I will put my money on that girl. Those are the lips I want after prayer.
Powerful. There's a few other angels in there along the way too afterwards that Joseph had to pick up the phone for.
Yeah. Yeah. And he, and we've been studying, I'm sure, last year with the year of Joseph, I wasn't listening to your show continuously, but I'm sure you had a lot of Joseph stuff going on. And,
We did.
I think all of us learned so much about St. Joseph that we didn't know last year, and you're right. I mean, I was thinking about my reflection, which I had written at that point, on the Virgin Annunciate, thinking about Joseph and how many, was it 4 dreams I think he responded to, and how many of those I would have said, well, number 1, wrong number. Number 2, no, that's not my plan. We're not doing that. I mean, really.
I don't even speak the language.
Yeah, don't speak the language. Not a good idea. It's not going to work. Trust me.
We've been talking about Steve's new book, Pilgrimage to the Museum, Man's Search for God Through Art and Time. Steve will take you on the journey of 5,000 years in the book, and he will show you how art can lead you to God in the book. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It was a real pleasure.
And God bless.
You too. God bless.